Hi, my name is Ahmad.
Hi, my name is Steve.
And this is Exploration Radio. On this week's episode, Holly, welcome to Exploration Radio.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I guess the idea behind the discussion we wanted to have with you today is around this concept of mining 4.0 or the digitalization of mining. They're very motherhood statements, and there is not a lot of nuance in what they actually mean. Mm-hmm. So what we really wanted to have this conversation is, in different contexts, what do those things mean? And with your role in Unearth, you kind of sit in a very interesting space where, you know, you're not industry, but you're not purely a service provider that's selling technology to the industry. You're kind of the facilitator in the middle. So that's what we really wanted to have a chat about.
Great.
So let's start off with, how did Unearth come about?
So Unearth started back in around 2014 with our two founders, Justin and Zane. Both had their own startups in oil and gas in this case. And they had been given great feedback that they had great products. They were moving in the right direction. They had something that was really important to industry. Yet when it came to engaging with people they were selling their products to, i.e. the oil and gas companies, they came across, as you'd expect, the common blockers that startups do in terms of how they could actually engage with those companies. And they found that basically it was impossible to do business. So they realized this is a fundamental problem. You had startups out there creating amazing technologies. They're incredibly agile. They're able to test a lot of things in the marketplace, but they couldn't engage with the people that often really needed those products. So Unearth was started to really bridge that gap between the startup sector and large industry, and particularly in the resources sector, so mining, oil and gas. Mm-hmm. And while Unearth is really known for, originally for the hackathons and those kind of in-person events that we started doing, that was really because we saw the way to get industry engaged is to get them out the building and actually doing something and engaging with people outside of their current sphere and seeing the value and feeling that value that they could get from that.
Not being so siloed as these companies often tend to be.
Yes, and realizing, you know, people with different skill sets to what you're used to can provide incredible value back to you by looking at your problems in a totally different way. So that was really how Unearth came about, and it's grown from that now into broader crowdsourcing, but still supporting and helping startups grow and provide them with access to market and access to customers. And really, we're trying to grow the overall pool of startups in the resources sector, encourage more people to start businesses in the sector as well.
So how did you get involved in Unearth?
So I'm a geologist, exploration geologist by background. So
we won't hold that against you. That's fine.
No, so I still call myself a geologist, although, you know, so many people start off their conversations with, well, I used to be a geologist, or by trade I'm a geologist. But I was an incredibly passionate exploration geologist. Absolutely loved it. I love field work. That was really my background. Studied geology at uni in the UK and came out to Australia.
Another poem in Perth.
Yeah, can't get rid of us. But yeah, originally I came out just to fund my backpacking trip to South America. But I just absolutely loved it. It blew me away that someone would actually pay you to go and run around in the outback. And I just thought it was phenomenal. I think geology as a career provides you as amazing opportunities to travel and see parts of the world that you would never see otherwise. And top that off with the kind of the thrill that you get through exploring and looking for something that no one's found before. Yep. It's an incredible career. So I really enjoyed that. But when I came to Unearth, I'd kind of been doing exploration geology for around 10 years. And whilst I loved that field aspect, I was getting a little bit jaded by some of the other aspects of the industry. And I was really looking for a role where I could make a difference in a broader sense. So
like impact the industry in the way that's...
Yeah, exactly. So when I came across Unearth, I saw what they were doing and I thought it was so important. And even at an early stage, they're having such an impact on individuals and the industry generally. And I just thought it was something that, for me, I'd love to be a part of.
So you just briefly mentioned that you were somewhat jaded working as a exploration geologist, largely in the junior kind of market.
Yeah.
Care to comment? What were some of the things that led you to be somewhat jaded?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, over time, you start to see different aspects of that industry. And the junior sector is really interesting. There's a lot of people working in that space. And for me, it was really, you know, a couple of things I found for publicly listed companies, it's hard, right? You know, you're constantly having to go back to the market to raise money. There's lots of up and downs, and we know that the industry is circular and there are ups and downs. But even aside from that, there's a constant having to go back to shareholders and to the market for cash, to top up cash. And what that means often is that there's limited expenditure actually for exploration activities in the junior sector. So, you know, often you find yourself without much of a budget to do much work. And because there's generally high corporate overheads across the board and there's many, many companies, if you look at the landscape overall, you know, there's lots of companies with a couple of tenements. All of them have high corporate overheads. So that a lot of that overall expenditure and investment that goes into exploration is spent in the corporate side and listing requirements. And
yeah, there's a lot of inefficiency in that whole setup.
I mean, for me, the companies that I worked with in the actual geological work was great. And I think what drew me to the junior sector in the first place was just that being able to really run projects, have a lot more impact as an individual, decision-making rights, responsibility, that kind of thing. And really in the junior sector, while you don't have as much money, you are able to be innovative in the way that you think and the way that you do things, and you're not constrained to particular processes per se. So that side of it for me, I really enjoyed, and certainly, you know, working on fairly unique deposits, we were able to do things in a different way, which we probably wouldn't have done in a larger companies. There were certainly the positives as well.
It's a very good point that you are the architect of your own success and demise in a lot of ways. I also got to say that you worked in a junior company doing uranium.
Yep.
Was that prior or post the uranium market completely falling apart?
It was kind of during. So
Perfect.
Yeah, I've had an interesting career. I've worked mostly in uranium and rare earths, so non-traditional. I've had a very short period in gold, but definitely not your classic Western Australian geologist by any means.
So is there a part of your career in the junior space that got you more interested in open innovation side of things? Is there a reason? Do you see there a need in how junior companies work where they could leverage the expertise of the crowd or...
Yeah, definitely. I suppose to answer the first part of the question, I certainly wasn't thinking about the crowd when I was working in the junior explorers. I was thinking more about technology. You know, I think when everyone starts out thinking about innovation, they're thinking about tech. They're thinking about what tech can I bring in and what's the next best thing I can use. And particularly in exploration, we're always trying to find something new that can give us a new type of data to better define or better indicate where our ore body is. So one thing for me that we worked on, which was, you know, not cutting edge really per se now, but we did a lot of work with portable XRF in real time data. So we were one of the first companies to release a JORC compliant resource with portable XRF data in that resource. So it might not sound that groundbreaking, but at the time it was something that no one was doing, and everyone was very critical of anybody that was trying to do it because they often didn't back it up with the test work, which we did. So that was pretty interesting, but I think I suppose my ideas and perception of innovation since I've worked at Unearthed has probably shifted, and I'm not necessarily just looking now at what technologies that can change exploration, but how we can do things differently, how we can work differently, how we can specifically use data differently, which I think is, from a crowd perspective, an interesting approach.
So do you think we have an over-reliance on technology at times?
I think we just have a perception that innovation equals technology, and that's just not the only avenue for change. So for me, the two big changes in exploration that I think we'll see coming, there will be technological advances which help us better define and identify ore bodies.
Which are inevitable.
Yeah, but we will also see a change of how we use data better, which I think will really change our discovery rate. And that might not be what people will classically, you know, define as innovation.
And I think it's probably one of the most underutilized resource that we have is the data that we actually collect.
Yeah.
You know, not just say within one company, but if you look at a project that changes multiple hands, when companies collect roughly the same data in different ways through those generations, if we were better at handling our data, it would actually be used a lot more down the line as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I've done the classic work that every exploration geologist has done of searching through historical reports and compiling old data from the government online services and things like that. And it always occurred to me every time I was doing that, that probably 5 people had done the exact same work before me, and this really doesn't seem to be an efficient process. So I think there's definitely something in how the data is stored and partly how it's recorded, but more how it's stored. And I think if you look at the majority of the systems that the governments have developed to allow people to view and access that data, they've been developed from the point of view of how you might traditionally interrogate data, how you want to go and look at a tenement and see what previous results may be in that tenement, and you download them as individual files for individual reports of work that was done. There hasn't been much thought around how you might use that in a broader sense for analytics or other more modern approaches that people are trying to do now. So it is still fairly difficult to use those open data sources in a meaningful way on a large scale. We're certainly seeing change, and I think the Queensland government later this year will be releasing and opening up their data lake with data APIs. So that's the first time that we'll see something a bit different in Australia. And Australia is certainly leading the way. So even though I'm being slightly critical, we're better than everybody else by quite a long way.
Yeah, that's right. I think Australia, the environment and how geological surveys work here with data, the amount they collect and how much they make readily available, I think is definitely very unique.
Completely. And that's from the aspect of, look at particularly at South Australia, the amount of data they collect themselves in terms of the surveys that they do, that's pretty incredible. But also the legislation that they have in place to ensure that privately acquired data becomes public in a certain time frame as well. So I think there's both lessons to be learned there in other countries, that having the right legislation to ensure that private data does become useful over time, but also investing in the right data collection sources yourself. I mean, I've been watching, some of the stuff coming out of the US about how they really want to source a lot of their critical metals from internal deposit. It's so difficult to do any exploration work in the US. So I find that interesting that they're pushing to do that, but yet there's no policy or data availability to,
that's right.
Incentivize explorers.
And it'll be interesting to see how that thread plays out. Do you need the policy first to push people to behave a certain way, or who comes together to start putting the data sets together or starts putting the work together to allow people to go find these things? What's the catalyst for it? Is it policy? And if that's the case, then I think that's one view that they're going to try, is they're going to change the policy, and that's how they incentivize people. I think in Australia, it's the opposite approach, that we invest in the money and give the data away. And if that encourages people to look in Australia, then that's better than them looking elsewhere. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah,
I think we have a very healthy perception of how we generate economic opportunities in our states. And from a geological point of view, like the surveys understand that if they spend money collecting this data, it will bring money back to them in terms of the money that's spent. So that sounds very logical.
I quite like the point you made there as well, is that there is a double reason why exploration companies, or as an industry, we struggle. That one is the fact that the way we handle the data, the way we store it, the way we distribute it, the way we present it for people to use is built in a very narrow way. So there's obviously that side, which is that the data isn't in the best way for us to utilize. But then the other side of it is that I think this is the point I want to get into, is that I think there's a skills problem on the other side as well, that as geologists, we don't necessarily have the skills to handle the data in a large manner or in a very global manner.
Yeah, I think that would be fair. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of people now looking to the likes of machine learning and more advanced analytics, or really any statistical techniques which allow you to deal with multiple layers of data. Geologists are scientists and usually have a decent level of mathematical skills. Not everyone, but as a general rule, I think most geologists have enough scientific background to deal with numbers fairly well. But when it comes to looking at hundreds to thousands of layers of data, that needs to have a more advanced approach.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think people are moving towards that avenue of machine learning and are certainly looking for people with those skill sets to either bring into their company or, tap into through the crowd.
Yeah, I guess that was going to be my question, is that the role that crowdsourcing really plays in this space? Is that as companies or organizations, you don't have that skill set in-house, and you can't really wait for the next batch of graduates to come out with data analytics skills. So is that the reason why you think crowd is the way to get around that?
I think that's one of the reasons. I think particularly with data science and machine learning, what's interesting is that the majority of people don't learn these skills in school. They're often self-taught. We're not seeing everyone coming out with a computer science degree that then goes in, becomes a data scientist. A lot of people have backgrounds in different disciplines. And that's because they can learn these skills online from anywhere around the world. And that's why we're seeing such a distributed workforce. Mm-hmm. You can't go somewhere necessarily per se, perhaps maybe Stanford or MIT, and find, the best data scientists. So our traditional ways of hiring people out of university or in our local area may mean that we can't actually tap into the skills that we want and that we need. They're not always going to be in your local area. So the crowd offers you the opportunity to tap into a global network, and people can work where they want to or from wherever they want to and for whatever kind of hours they want to. So it's a different way of working. The Explorer Challenge, though, I think what's really interesting is, and this is probably a first for Unearth when I think about it, is we're really trying to use that concept of the wisdom of the crowd. And what I mean by that is that we're saying the average is better than an individual.
Yeah, the consensus view should be better than an individual's view.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a concept that probably many people aren't necessarily familiar with and to think about in line with exploration. The book, The Wisdom of the Crowd, I think came out in early 2000s. And really that was kind of popularizing that concept that, the average of many people, is better than any individual result. And I think some of the opening of that book was around, those kind of ideas of guessing how many pennies there are in a jar.
That's right.
Those kind of things, like the average is always going to be closer than any individual. And what I find interesting about that is if you look now, there's actually quite a lot of companies on the market which use these kind of, I don't think they necessarily use the word crowd, but distributed collection of predictions and averages of predictions, like in sports betting, in predicting news events, predicting markets. And these are, billion-dollar companies. So there's a genuine move and understanding that the consensus model is often more preferable to any individual.
Yep.
For me, where I find this really interesting in exploration is because when we actually look to how we traditionally do exploration, we're incredibly biased and we're intentionally very, very biased. So, and what I mean by that, if you think about, say you have an example exploration company looking for Archean orogenic gold, you only want to employ geologists that have experience in Archean gold.
Yeah, which is a fundamental flaw in the whole setup.
But that's what we think is our advantage, right?
Yep.
So we feel that we have an advantage because we're employing these experts that know about these type of deposits. So we're much more likely to be able to find deposits and get more value out of them. And we do the same when it comes to consultants. We have an idea. We want to look for structurally hosted deposits. So we employ a structural expert to help us look for those. So we're adding on constant layers of expertise, which is also bias. Mm-hmm. And we have a very strong tie in exploration to expertise. As a young geologist myself, there was no way I was getting a job in gold if I'd never worked in gold. Like, it's not going to happen.
And I think that's a fair point that, we are in exploration. I think as an industry as well, we are very driven by the view that experts will provide us the best outcome.
So I think what we'll see through the work we're doing with Oz Minerals on this Explorer Challenge, we're definitely promoting the idea and this concept of consensus may be better than the individual expert. So what we're going to be able to do through this competition is combine hundreds of models and targets into a one consensus model. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how successful that can be in identifying those top targets. And I'm hoping that we'll have the opportunity to do that a number more times and then showcase how that may work and validate that. I'm comfortable that our scientific knowledge is good enough for us to regularly define, broad areas of prospectivity. Mm-hmm. We are pretty good at being able to identify regions that are prospective for certain mineralization types. So our knowledge about mineralization and or deposit formation is good enough. But where we haven't cracked it is that point location, deposit scale ability to
Yeah.
predict where deposits are. That's why we have an understanding that our success rate is very low. We use a lot of different data to help us. But at the end of the day, there's no people out there that are really good at finding deposits at that real local scale. So there's a genuine opportunity that consensus approach of having lots of different opinions and lots of different models could be a really genuine opportunity to do something a bit different to increase that discovery rate. On that kind of same line of thought, if we go back to the machine learning example, we're seeing a lot of people use more machine learning techniques. But when we think about how people are using that, when we use machine learning, we're trying to predict something often. We're using neural net, deep learning, whatever, to make a prediction. So we have to ask a specific question. The companies that are coming out in the market are producing models which are good at predicting specific types of mineralization. So perhaps like porphyry copper or something like that. And you see that across the board with any use of machine learning in any industry, right? We don't have general AI. We use specific machine learning algorithms to predict things. And so in the case of targeting, you're always going to have more benefit from comparing multiple models than ever just using one model. An example that's slightly off topic, but if you look at what people are doing with computer vision in core photography, for example, you have one algorithm to identify your structures. You have one algorithm to tell you your lithology. You have one algorithm to identify your fracture frequency, one algorithm to recognize your text written in your core. So you've got all these different algorithms that come together. And
it's a stacked approach that, by stacking them on top of each other, you get the best product at the end. Your point is a very valid one in that exploration right now, for a number of reasons, I don't think we have the ability to test multiple models very quickly. From a generative point of view, usually there's a little bit of thinking that goes in. Maybe the thinking part tests the different models. Empirically, we don't really have the ability to test those models.
No, and I think the way we think about testing multiple models is still in a very linear way. We have a model and we go and test it, and then in a particular way, and then if it doesn't work, then we may have maybe look at a different model and then go and test that. And what I like about the consensus approach, particularly the way we're doing it with ours, is that it allows you to actually quantitatively bring together all the different models and their outputs into one. So you're automatically then having that combined one consensus model, which you can then go and test, the highest frequency target that was generated, for example. So I think it's an opportunity to do that in a quantitative way, which we often don't see.
I mean, I agree. The thing that I like about the Explorer Challenge is the fact that it's an experiment to run to see how well does that work on a large scale. Often in companies, I think in big companies where you have a big group, you probably do that, where you take a consensus view by passing the project through the geophysicist and the geologist, someone else, all the way through. So you do kind of do the consensus view. Obviously, you're limited by the resources that are available to you at that point. But it'll be interesting to see what happens if you throw that net as wide as possible and see what type of models do you come in. I mean, intuitively, I think you'll introduce a lot more noise in the system, but surely your signal should get better then as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it definitely there will be a lot of noise if we're pulling together probably in the range of 1,000 different targets or more.
But the group should mature through that process as well, right? So it's not that. I mean, I guess what I think instinctively the answer will be that if the first ones fail, people go, "Oh, it didn't work." It's like, well, there is a learning curve in that. If you do it a number of times, then the crowd gets better, everyone gets better through feedback. So, and then I think that's also an important part in the whole process as well.
Yeah, I find the Oz Minerals aren't the first people to do this type of challenge, and although we're trying to take it in a different approach and encourage more of a data science approach than what's been done previously, but I was always fascinated by the original Goldcorp challenge, being that was back in the year 2000, so almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And then, Goldcorp did a similar thing where they put out a lot of their exploration data. I can't remember the name of the deposit, Red Lake or something.
Was that the Integra?
No, so that Integra was after that. That was in 2015, but the original Goldcorp challenge was back in 2000.
Oh, okay.
And I think, total data was something like 200 megabytes or something back then. But the fascinating thing about that was that they were very clear about the outcome and that they kind of turned them from a struggling small miner into finding $6 billion worth of gold through the competition. So what always interests me was having an incredible success story like that which was fairly well broadcast, why is it that no one else followed that? Why did no one else realize this, the huge value of the wisdom of the crowd in that sense?
So you sit in Unearth where you go and pitch this to companies. What are some of the reasons you hear for people not going down this path?
Well, there's reasons you hear, and then there's other, reasons that you infer. I think, for me, there's a couple of things. There's generally, there is obviously the clear perception of the risk of putting your data into the public domain. I think that's probably one of the major things that holds people back. And
the risk is what? That other people will do something with the data that you haven't been able to do?
Yeah, so I think there's usually two kind of concerns, and one of them in particular I think is fairly genuine. So if you're in an early stage exploration, and we've seen this recently with Rio, as soon as there was a sniff of Rio doing something up in the Pilbara, all the tenements were snapped up everywhere. So I think if you're doing something early stage and you're starting to understand the mineral field, you don't necessarily want to talk publicly about that because you want to have the first rights on picking up ground.
Yeah, that's your competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's fair. So there's a genuine risk around releasing data at that stage. But we don't seem to really see a change in that perception of risk, even in later stages in projects with most people. Mm-hmm. And when you look to the situation that Oz Minerals are in, they've held that ground for a long time, and they've been working on it also for a long time. So they've got 10 years worth of exploration data that they've collected. And they haven't, within their internal teams, been able to find additional economic mineralization outside of Prominent Hill and the underground extension. Mm-hmm. So for them, they don't see any risk, really, in putting that data out in the public. You could argue that someone could find something, wait for them to drop the ground and go and pick it up, but I just don't really see that as really that feasible. The other thing that people obviously worry about is that their data holds kind of the key to that exploration model for that specific deposit type.
Yep.
So if you have the idea that you have the best exploration model for porphyry copper deposits and you don't want to share that with anyone, you may see that that's a risk by putting your data out there. That's something I don't buy, to be honest. I think that, most geological models at that kind of scale are fairly public. We all kind of share that knowledge. I don't think it's very common to have, one company that has this high level of IP around a particular deposit type that they know much better than everybody else. So,
but it's also confusing, the concept of data versus knowledge.
Yes.
The data doesn't hold intrinsic knowledge. You can actually build that knowledge up over time. So by giving the data away, you don't necessarily give all your knowledge away either.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely a reason around the data security risk side. And the other one, I think, is just a fundamental, human nature objection to change, It's really a different way of working, and
which is probably the main reason why a lot of these things fall over, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, and you've seen yourself, I think, what I see a lot in exploration is that there's a lot of really great startups in the exploration space, and they can clearly have a clear value proposition that they can save you a lot of money and a lot of time, but still...
It's not how I work.
Yeah, it's not how I work. It's okay. I'm all good as I am. There's not much incentive to do anything in a different way.
So let's go back to the challenge that you're running right now. Who approached who? Did Oz come to you guys? Can you talk about how that came about?
Yeah, well, I think so. So they did approach us. So Richard Holmes, who's the exploration manager at Oz. So we mentioned before, kind of Goldcorp and the Integra Challenge. The Integra Challenge happened in 2015. Mm-hmm. And I think Richard had seen that and thought, what a fantastic idea, and had actually been kind of lobbying internally with Oz and the board there to do something like that for a couple of years. And I think it was natural for them to come to Unearth, just being, an Australian company. They knew of us, that we were doing crowdsourcing in resources. So it was kind of a natural match. And I also happen to know one of the geos there from my previous life as a geo. So they kind of reached out to me. For us, it wasn't we didn't go and do a sales pitch or something like that. Obviously we definitely said, yes, we can definitely do this. And I think it suited our community, and it suited what we're trying to do as well. It's a really great way to be able to showcase what data science can do. And it's a really great way to bring more people into mining as well and show the opportunity there.
We're trying to get Richard on this podcast, but my assumption would be it would be a great way for them to experiment to see what data science could actually do. And then they, as a group, as an exploration group, can then decide which parts they put into their workflow, what they do with it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I see the benefit for them, aside from the fact that they might find a deposit, which would be great as well. But I think there's a genuine kind of corporate learning aspect that I think is something that other companies should think about as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're not doing this as a kind of one-off, like we're just doing this exciting one-off.
Yeah, we had $1 million to waste, so let's put it in this thing.
It's really strategic in that they believe that working differently will provide success to them, and they are very interested in the data science side. They're also doing a lot internally already. They work with a number of different analytics companies. They do a lot of different tests, like around machine learning applications and things like that. So this is really complementary.
They also have a data scientist on staff in exploration. Yeah. Richard, who's going to be on the show as well, another Richard.
Yeah, and he's fascinating. I'm sure you talked a little bit about his background as well.
Yeah, that's right. So I see them actually giving this a fair shake to try to see what they can get out of it as well. Whereas you're right in the sense that I think the previous two by the Canadian companies, I don't think they went down this path. It was more of a short term, can we get something that we can utilize and then kind of move on? Whereas Oz, to me anyways, as an outsider, it seems like that they are trying to do something a little bit more longer term.
And I think that's, I mean, I don't know really with Goldcorp what the progression was there. I think with Integra, so Steve de Jong, who was the CEO at the time, Integra actually got bought out, I think around 18 months after the competition finished.
Yeah, it was massively successful. They got bought out.
So I think then, he obviously went into a different company, different role, but I think he has that intention to always do things in a little bit of a different way. And so I think if the company still remained as it was, you probably would have seen something extended there. But yeah, certainly, I totally agree. I think the team at Oz, they're really trying to test things and do things differently and see what works. And they've got the full support of the company to do that, which is great. So it's been a huge pleasure to work with them throughout that process. And I just really like as well how open they are about their opinions of like, yes, this is what we think. There's a lot of people, obviously, when you do something different that come out and say, you obviously don't trust your geologists, or, all these criticisms. And so it's great to see that they're kind of, standing their ground.
I think that view came out really clearly in the discussion with Richard, is that he is not an outsider where the group thinks he has no value and they're just waiting out this experiment of hiring this data scientist. He is an integral part of the group, and the geologists are trying to figure out how they can best utilize Richard's skill set. And Richard's trying to figure out how best he can get the domain expertise from the geologist to run the stuff that he needs to do. So it does seem like they have quite a very open way of establishing that this is how we might have to work.
And I think the way their exploration team is structured as well, I wouldn't say dictates that, but encourages it, because they have such a lean team. I mean, I think they have around 5 exploration geologists, which is really small considering the size of the company.
Yep.
So they have global exploration. The benefit that they get from analytics and being able to assess early stage projects around the world and their own projects that they have is huge. And I think that, like you say, matching that domain expertise with the analytics is a big challenge for anyone. So the process that they're going through to do that, I think, is adding a lot of value.
And I want to go back to a point you just made, which is, I think, quite important, is exploration at its fundamental sense is a lot about generating ideas. So when you are a small team, you are somewhat limited by the ideas you can generate by the people that are sitting around the table. So if you are an exploration group and you want to expand the ideas that you have, then I think crowdsourcing is a way that you should go, because how else are you going to allow new ideas to come into your company if you're only limited to the 5 people you can talk to?
Yeah, and that was really a lot of their motivation to do this as well. I think specifically around on the project that they put forward, which is around Prominent Hill, they have some of the world's best IOCG geologists in their team. And they, applied extensive modeling experience around that type of deposit to the tenement package that they had to look for, that kind of mineralization and similar to Prominent Hill. But they also at the same time identified that because they were so focused on that one specific style, they could have easily missed something else or a different deposit type. And so they're quite convinced that there's something else of interest out there that their expertise doesn't necessarily lend itself to identifying because they work in a certain way. So they're very open in that. And explaining what they'd done, explaining the processes they'd taken in the exploration projects that they'd done over the area. And kind of identifying those potential weaknesses, which is really refreshing because you often don't hear that, going back to the discussion I was saying before, you only want to hire certain geologists with certain experience. They're kind of definitely understanding the value of differences of opinion and really looking for that. I think for them, that's what they see they'll really get out of this competition.
That's a very good point, that you have to be aware of what limitations you have as a group as well. And I don't think that level of honesty has been very prevalent in the exploration industry previously.
No, and you can kind of understand that in a way, like everyone's trying to protect their bit of turf. Everyone wants to be thought of as the expert and the one that's delivering value. So it's not an easy thing. It's the people that are able to think at the level of how does the business succeed rather than how do I succeed as an individual are really the ones that are able to think about how getting different expertise can be really valuable.
So let's fast forward. Yeah, Explorer Challenge finishes. It works out. It works for Oz. What are you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, I think definitely would like to see the market, follow in the footsteps of Oz. As Unearthed and what we do, you'll see we change a lot. So from everything that we do, we're trying to learn what's the right approach. How do we do it differently? How do we do it a bit better? I think something that we're really interested to learn in this case is ultimately what Oz are looking at as the main outcome of this is a way to identify high quality targets. So a challenge for us is we're getting hundreds of submissions. How do we quantitatively assess what a high quality target looks like? So that's a big challenge, right? So we're not going to get that answer from this competition, but we're going to get on a step to learning.
Because that is really the product that you're giving back to Oz out of running this competition is, you're giving submissions. The submissions are based on a perception that someone thinks that the work they've done is identified a high value target. Now, whether that perception fits in with what Oz is looking for or what you might be looking for as well, maybe, that might be completely different.
So there's an interesting thing there. And I think we talked a lot about the consensus model and we will be, providing this combined model as well. So we definitely want to learn and be able to validate and test how much that idea of that the consensus is better than these individual results. What does that actually look like? Obviously, in this case, we are awarding individual teams. So we're not providing financial rewards to every single person that's contributed to that consensus model. We're awarding individual teams. So there's certainly an interesting thing for us as Unearthed to think about how we go down this journey. What does the incentive structure look like going forward? For this, we've got, $1 million of prize money, and that is distributed, right? So we're not awarding that to one person. That's split between around, I think, 15 or so different prizes. So I wanted to make sure that people are rewarded. But there is some thought around what does a future incentive model look like.
Do you mean like democratize the incentives a little bit more so more people are interested?
Yeah, and I don't have the answer to that, but it's something that we think about. So if we're thinking about a long-term model where we're asking the crowd to keep producing these kind of consensus models around targeting, what's their incentive to do so? And have we got that right this first time? Whenever you do anything with the crowd, there's always a learning of what's the incentive for them to take part, and that changes with different activities. So I think that's something we're always learning as well. But ultimately, to kind of scale and go down this process, where if we really believe consensus modeling for exploration is a much more preferable approach, we have to get the incentives right on both sides. The exploration company is getting a huge amount of value out of it by having these really high quality targets. How does that value transfer back to the crowd?
Do you think the fact that you have to work on this model may prevent companies from engaging with you guys because they're waiting for you to figure out the perfect model, the incentive model?
Oh, yeah, probably. But that's, the standard, whatever curve is it, early adopters, and then I can't remember all the phases, but you always have that.
Has that been a barrier to date where people go, well, since you don't know what the appropriate model is, we don't want to invest in it until you figure it out?
No, but I suppose we don't really talk like that either. I mean, I think with everything that we're doing, we're quite communicative that we're always developing products and we're always trying to improve what we do. So, with any startup, you're testing something in the market, and even once you have a product, you're still testing something new and you want to stay ahead of the game and you want to, constantly be innovating yourself. So I think companies that understand that and are trying doing that themselves, they are happy with our business model and how we do that. I think certainly in the exploration stage, we're figuring it out, but we don't really talk that publicly about where we're at with a potential business model or what we might think about changing. The interesting thing for me will be, if we demonstrate well the value that Oz receive from the competition, will there be, people that want to follow in their footsteps? As I said before with Goldcorp, it's interesting that didn't happen. So I think we have to be conscious of how we articulate that value in a way and the process in a way that incentivize people to get involved because it's a real benefit for them.
I think that's a really good point, actually, that if the incentive was finding a deposit of some means of getting additional revenue, that surely Goldcorp should have allowed other people to jump on. But that didn't quite happen. So maybe the industry is still looking for a different incentive. And I don't know what that is, but it's a very valid point.
Yeah, and we as well are thinking, what types of companies in the market, is it likely to be similar companies to Oz? I imagine people in a similar situation where they've been holding an area of ground for quite a long time and have spent quite a bit of money on it will be in a similar position where they're kind of willing to say,
and if they're running out of ideas, then it's worth kind of throwing it.
And there's other things behind it as well. And I don't think this was a driver for Oz, but you've got things like if you've held ground for 10 years, your tenement expenditure is going to be pretty high.
Yep.
Like, it goes up substantially every year. So you're looking at a large area of ground. You're going to have, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of expenditure that you need to commit to anyway.
That's high.
So you've got to do something. You really want to get that as much value you can out of that ground. It really just makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll see, or I imagine that we'll see companies in that kind of situation come to the party first. And that, again, because they've held the ground for so long, they're not really so worried about that data security.
I mean, I guess that necessity is the mother of invention in that sense.
And then they're on the other side of it, which, again, haven't explored in too much detail, but we see where if you look at the area of the market that's really driven to be able to identify targets, it's the investment community or for mergers and acquisitions.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you enable people to quickly identify high quality targets, which they want to just outright purchase? So I think that's the other area of the market, which is slightly different to just the explorer themselves, and people that are wanting to. So I see that as probably something that we're seeing happen with a lot of the data science exploration companies in the market. So Goldspot or Classic Quant, a lot of the work they're doing now is going into helping people make investment decisions. And so I think we'll see that really go down that road, is that everybody wants to pick up that asset and identify that asset faster than anybody else does.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see how the whole Goldspot thing plays out, both from the investment side, what type of returns do they get out of the targets that they provide, and obviously, as an investment side, they have to sell it on. So what type of returns are they getting from that point as well?
Yeah, I like that. I like that they've publicly listed now, that there's a lot more kind of public information about what they're doing.
Right.
And it's certainly got the market's interest, right? I think, someone did mention to me that part of the reason they went public was for that marketing aspect, so that they just get a lot more exposure, and it certainly worked from that perspective, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it stops being a little bit more black box as well. What are these dudes doing in there? So they obviously have to be a lot more open about what they're doing. I think it adds a little bit of transparency that maybe makes people a little bit more comfortable in buying their products as well. So let's fast forward, and I guess we've kind of talked a little bit about this. So what are some of the competitive advantages that you think companies could utilize in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in the, example we're talking about with the Explorer Challenge, it's the ability to generate targets faster and higher quality targets faster. So assuming, we're able to prove that over time more definitively, I think there's a really obvious value add there in just the pure ability to generate targets in a much more efficient way, and high quality targets as well. My belief is if we're able to generate and more quantitatively talk about targets, that the investment community will change. So at the moment, investing in exploration companies, particularly juniors, high risk, potential high return. But I think we may see, if we really are able to prove more quantitatively quality of targets, that investment appetite may change, and some more sophisticated investors in the market, which currently don't look to exploration, may start looking that way. I mean, we've seen the recent example of Bill Gates investing in Cobalt Metals, AI machine learning exploration company. Interestingly, for me, there hasn't been much talk about that in Australia, but I think it's really interesting to see a totally different type of investor class really coming on and looking at exploration. And they're really, actually, if you look at what they're doing, not necessarily doing anything in a dramatically different.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, it's really interesting to see what's the motivation for that type of Silicon Valley investor in going into the space. Like, what are they hoping to get? There's a huge spin about ethical sourcing of metal, which I think is probably why they're their main driver in getting in that space. But still, it is a gateway into them accessing this industry.
Yeah.
And there is plenty of evidence of, I think, that type of crowd circling mining as well. I mean, if you think about, our biggest end user for metals is tech in a lot of ways. So eventually, they're going to start looking up the supply chain to see what they could do around that space. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do have more of a footprint in this in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, and I think there are already those companies kind of investing into different stages of projects, but it often tends to be a bit more downstream. But yeah, I think certainly there's a chance that change in investor type and that change in investor environment could, kind of fundamentally change how we do exploration, particularly in Western Australia and the number of juniors that we have here. But kind of going back to just general kind of incentives for crowdsourcing and that value add, I think a lot of people now and mining companies in general are kind of realizing that their competitive advantage is kind of speed, not necessarily even data or particular tech IP. So I think the ability that the crowd gives you to generate new ideas, develop solutions, automate processes is something that really can make a big difference and provide that competitive advantage.
I like the fact that you said it's speed, because I think the perception maybe is that it's speed in testing ideas, but I think it's also in the fact that it's the speed of decision making that it might allow you. If you come up with better targets, then you have to do less work on the targets that you have. Like right now, we generate 50 targets, but we don't really know which one of them could be better than the other. If we become a little bit more quantitative, maybe we could actually tell that 5 of them are standouts, the other 45 are relatively less. So you have, I think, a speed of making decision making that could improve as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what we hope. I think I don't know if that's what I would like to think, but I don't know how much that, in an exploration sense, speed is a value driver. It certainly should be.
Yep.
But I think we often see that, particularly again, going back to junior market, that and probably even in the majors, they're not too worried about the length of time.
But the quality of decision making in exploration, I think, will definitely be a competitive advantage. Yeah, when your probability of success is 0.01 and you can do it 5% better, that's a phenomenally different change.
And I think it's not, in terms of the concept of it, it's not a bridge too far. I mean, if you think about the standard process that an exploration geologist goes through, most of us have, targeting matrices where, weight certain factors like geochemistry higher than gravity, mag higher than radiometric. So, we look for certain anomalies and we weight them based on, how important they are to the specific things that we're looking for. So we understand that, but we haven't necessarily been able to do it in a way other than that kind of standard linear process that we're used to.
The method that we currently use relies on a lot of cognitive or heuristics, I should say.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting if we put a lot of those heuristics in the workflow to see what comes out. I personally think there's a really fertile place to play here is to see that you could get a human heuristic method and you could get a machine method, and it'll be interesting to see what the difference between the two would be. And maybe that's one way you can calibrate one and the other as you go along.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge for us when we're talking about how to qualify the quality of a target. You're going to have targets that are generated from machine learning models, and you're going to have targets that are generated by geologists and their, backing rationale behind it. So it is a challenge. How do you compare and combine those in terms of just like talking about their quality relative to each other? that is a significant challenge.
It's like the centaur model from chess that, you used to have chess masters that reached a certain ranking, and then you had a machine that came out that went slightly higher. But when you combine them, they actually beat both of them. So maybe that's actually the model we will inevitably end up with, but we have to kind of experiment to get there.
And I think that's what's nice about the way we're doing the consensus model, is that you can, because we're really just asking people to provide us with targets and prospectivity maps, we can combine all of those outcomes without having to necessarily know the process that has gone behind creating them.
No, that's fine. So we're getting towards the end of our interview, and we always ask our guests 2 questions. First one is, what is something that you think needs to die in mining? It could be an idea, a concept, a behavior, anything that we need to jettison out of the industry.
Well, that's a tough question. So I think, I guess, kind of based on the conversation we've had today, I think certainly some of those ideas that the expert is always the best. I wouldn't say it needs to die. That's probably a bit intense, but I think we definitely need to move away from that idea that we always have the right expertise for the problem that we're trying to solve. And then also just there's, the industry is often, and I think this is actually even stronger in geologists than probably in some other mining disciplines, but resistance to change and criticism of people whenever they do anything new is really rife. So I think just a change in behavior to, understand when something's new to the market, that there is going to be a learning curve, and that to try and be part of that process of learning and seeing how it can complement your workflow, rather than saying this will never work, or, oh, you haven't considered this and you haven't done that. So that's a behavior that I would like to see change, I suppose.
Good one. Conversely, what is something that you think we should maintain in mining or in our industry at all costs? Something that's fundamental to how we behave that we shouldn't forget at all?
So I suppose almost kind of, I hope I'm not contradicting myself here, but I think there's a lot of value behind the deep domain expertise that we do have. A lot of people in mining have worked in mining their whole career. They have, incredible domain knowledge of what they're working in, and that really allows them to do an amazing job. In geology, we are typically good scientists. We've come from a scientific background. We apply scientific theory, and I definitely wouldn't want to see that being lost. But I think a key thing is, with both that kind of scientific approach and domain expertise, is that we're able to bring that to new skills and new technologies and things that are outside of our domain. So the key for mining is being able to match well the domain expertise that we have and that we've developed with people who have skills that we need outside of our domain.
I think that's a good enough point to end on.
Great.
Thanks a lot for coming on our show, Holly.
Thank you very much for having me.
Exploration Radio is brought to you by Steve and Ahmad. This episode was produced and edited by Ahmad and recorded at Vision Studios in Perth. If you want to find out more about this podcast, check us out on explorationradio.com or follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. And we're even on Instagram. And if you like this podcast and want to help out, well, there's 2 things you can do for us. Give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And consider supporting us in producing more of this content. You can find the details on how to do that on our website at explorationradio.com/support. Until next time, let's keep exploring.